Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. We are happy to be with you again. And I would like to thank the organization committee for their effort and help. This session is about what globalization means for urban space. I think it is a kind of a very tricky word, this globalization, because on one hand, it represents a kind of a integrated unity, freedom, exchange of knowledge, kind of democracy, equality, but at the same time, on the other hand, it refers to a kind of a template which controls the whole world, the cultural sphere, the urban sphere, the economic sphere, and everything, which ends up with lots of problems as well, including placelessness, loss of identity, the control, tautological control of, let's say, many issues at a time. So, it has, I'm sure, multiple meanings for urban space as well, because urban space is the widest umbrella which holds all these discussion topics and contextual issues at a time. And it is also the most significant medium for commodification. Inevitably, it is transparent to lots of problematic issues, from environmental to identity crisis to economy, migration, everything. So I think it is one of the key issues to discuss and try to find solutions. And here today, we will try to understand the limits of the concept globalization towards its impact on urban space. I have here very distinguished guests who will handle the subject from different parts. And the language of the session panel will be both in English and Turkish, so you can raise questions in both languages. But to have a ground for discussion and questions, I would especially like our guests to limit their speeches within 18 minutes if possible, okay? And then so that we will maybe have 5 or 10 minutes extra time, because I was informed that at 11 strictly the final forum will start, maybe 11:10, 11:15, but we have to be finishing. Our first guest speaker is Paul Knox, on my left, is a distinguished professor, academician, and Dean of the Honors College and former Dean of the College of Architecture and Urban Studies in Virginia Tech in the United States. He is member of the editorial board of 7 international journals and has served as co-editor of Environment and Planning, co-editor of the Journal of Urban Affairs, and book review editor for Environment, Planning, Government and Policy. So you are on the right place. Thank you very much. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Let me add my thanks to the organizers, my appreciation for being here. It's a great honor. Thank you all for coming here. I'm going to do my best to be within the time limits. I can see the clock is already counting down here. I'm going to make some general remarks about globalization from my perspective and the built environment from my perspective. And I'm going to use examples from the places that I know best, which are mostly Western Europe and North America. So, can I get? Okay, it's working. So my starting point really is to emphasize that I see this whole enormous, complex subject matter through the lens of political economy, and in particular cultural economy. So I like to interpret urban spaces and the built environment through this particular lens. It's not the only one, but it's the one that I'm going to use. And because of this lens, one of my favorite metaphors is the built environment or urban spaces as palimpsests, as text, if you like, as layers that have been written down over time as one political economy evolves into another, slowly or more suddenly, over time, so that, as you can see with this image of Milan, the built urban spaces are not just going to be a product, they're not just remade or transformed by globalization. They have a legacy from pre-modern times through a whole series of different layers. And so these are the layers that I tend to see through my lens, certainly for the countries that I know best, and the very best, of course, United Kingdom, my home country. There is a pre-modern phase, there's a legacy from the first industrial revolution from, say, 1780 to 1850, the second industrial revolution, and so on through the welfare state really remade landscapes. Urban spaces were really transformed in a modernist sense through the golden age of planning. There was a dramatic change to landscapes because of that. We maybe from the mid-70s enter another general phase where the political economy changes again, the hallmark being neoliberalism, and we see other changes, and that's coincident with this, what we're talking about here, a phase of globalization, a second modernity, the term Ulrich Beck has used to describe what has happened, where globalization itself transcends the geopolitical framework and the administrative framework of the previous several phases of political economy. And so they begin to become redundant. Nation states which were framed, if you think back to your economic history, to capture and make efficient industrial systems are no longer sufficient. And so we have transnational organizations of every kind. And they have made some of our founding institutions from the first modernity a little bit redundant. Beck he's got this wonderful term you may be familiar with of zombie institutions, the Walking Dead of the 21st century. Nobody wants to be that, but many of us are trapped in institutions, legal, educational, professional, which are still framed around nation states. But of course, there's a lot more going on. And much of that has to do with the overall topic, I think, of this conference, of cities helping cities. Because as nation states have become slightly or significantly, in some cases, less relevant, and cities and city regions have become more relevant. And the networks, as we saw in the first session of the City Networks program on Tuesday, so many, I didn't realize there were so many networks around, but they are proliferating, and cities are becoming much, especially major cities, much stronger actors in the contemporary political economy. And so with this second modernity, to borrow from Beck, one of the characteristics is risk, avoiding risk, mitigating risk. And from that has come this very popular idea of resilience. If you're going to try and avoid risk, one of the ways to do that is to concentrate on resilience. I'm not going to speak very much about this. I think you're all here because you know about globalization. I just want to make the point that it is multidimensional, and that these many dimensions of globalization are interdependent. They're often conflicting, many times mutually reinforcing. And the question for us today is, what are the implications for urban spaces and the built environment? Some of those implications are less visible. I want to just mention that in previous sessions in this conference, I've noticed that some speakers, the speakers that I've heard, have alluded to smart cities in a way that seemed to assume that it was a given, that it was a good thing. I think some of the technology is good, useful, efficient, interesting, but I think there are going to be a lot of interesting questions with this kind of technology. I think this is one of the, it's maybe an invisible aspect of globalization and urban spaces, but it will have its effect on the way that communities are organized, on the winners and losers, especially if you imagine when artificial intelligence is coupled with the Internet of Things, and maybe, you know, who knows, who's going to control it may be like Facebook, where there's a virtual monopoly of the software systems that are running cities. What does it mean for governance? How can you govern a city that is, if it's not entirely tapped in to a smart network, who's in and who's out? It's a really interesting topic. But it hasn't to do with the physical environment. A lot of people will say that globalization is homogenizing urban spaces. And there's lots of examples of this. Some people talk about brandscapes, that we see the same international chains and franchises, and designscapes, that urban design has been producing very few ideas of any diversity about what city centers look like. Gentrification, gated communities, high-rise, shopping malls. And I think if you've, doesn't seem to be, yeah, we go. You know, it's a classic case, if you've seen one, you've seen them all. Whoops. So brandscapes, I think, will vary much more. This is a British example, but retail environments, high streets, in Britain's case, are being cloned. They're being made to look the same as one another because the traditional independent stores have all been displaced by chain stores, and they all have the same branding and logos and so on. So it makes for a certain degree of homogeneity. And at the other end, there are landscapes which are the consequence of the other end of globalization and neoliberalism. Okay, so one of the consequences of this is that placemaking and urban design and the quality of spaces has become more important. And as this quote shows, it used to be that the quality of urban spaces was a consequence of economic development, and now it seems it's the other way around. You can't get economic development unless you have a quality urban space. I think we heard our consultants from McKinsey and so forth in the first session really emphasizing the importance in their world, in the world of corporate consultancy, of quality of life and quality of the built environment. And so there's been a scramble. People talk about the Bilbao effect. Barcelona's another example, where investment in high-end urban design has been the driver of economic development. I'm sorry, I'm not so adept with this clicker as I would hope to be. So the experience economy and the way that tourism and the role of museums, high-end, high-visible museums, and sort of rock star art exhibits, the iconic flagship star architecture and star architects, the whole plays into the social and cultural appetite for celebrity. But here's the point that I really wanted to make, is that real estate investment is the driver. And again, I think back to the presentation by our colleague from Mackenzie and the way that he described the corporate approach to advising cities and to advising planners. It's really based around the prospects for real estate investment and the prospects to draw top firms and top people. And so I think this is a staggering statistic, that the value of real estate around the world is 3.5 times the global gross national product. And that is why when we think about urban spaces and globalization, I should be pointing this somewhere. There we are. That's why the real estate investment firms are really potentially the drivers, the group that we should look at in terms of understanding globalization and urban spaces and the many dimensions of it. So they have their own conferences, they have their own get-togethers, and this is where, planners and architects and social policy makers, we have our conferences, we trade ideas. It may be a little bit of an echo chamber as we all copy one another's ideas and policies, but they do it too, and I would argue that it's even more important, much more important, because they're the ones that are making the investment decisions. So what does that mean? It means that there's now what I call third-generation growth machines. So if you think back to the original growth machine literature, they were local, they were city-based, there were groups of local councillors, journalists, people who would try and attract economic development locally. Second generation, there will be national actors. Now this third generation, because of the importance of real estate investment, has a global dimension. So there's this third generation, and it's producing a third wave of gentrification. So again, the first wave gentrification was young professionals moving into low-cost neighborhoods. Second wave was more affluent professionals displacing those. And the third wave is mostly new build gentrification on brownfield sites. And those brownfield sites in this real estate global game are the most important. This is a Dockland example from London. But the real estate investors are running out of opportunities. And so what's happening in the United Kingdom, for example, is that the legacy from one of these previous phases of political economy, the post-Second World War welfare state landscape, is being removed and replaced by this neoliberal environment. So the picture on the top left was from social housing, which was billed as the estate of the future in the 1950s. Now it's being torn down. It's not a slum, but it's being torn down and it's being replaced by a corporate environment, Berkeley Homes. They sell these apartments in London now to purchasers from Hong Kong, the Middle East, Singapore, and you can imagine the implications politically and socially. I'm going to go through very quickly. I can see the clock ticking away. So a lot of what is happening is being packaged as resilience. Resilience is important. It's got a particular appeal in terms of cybersecurity, in terms of climate change, in terms of terrorism, but it's also got an appeal to cities generally, and this is one of the ideas that is cascading through, and it's got a strong appeal that cities themselves should be resilient. And again, I'm seeing the corporate hand here. It's not just Rockefeller Foundation was funding this for a while, but World Bank. Just move on quick. This one, I'll stop with this example. This is called the Crystal. It's an exhibition centre in London's Docklands, and it's run by Siemens Corporation. And it's open to the public, and the theme is sustainable urban development. But the reason it's there is to convene city leaders from all over the world. They bring mayors and city leaders from all over the world to London, a global city, and this is basically their sales floor for their software, transportation systems, and so forth. And so while I clearly don't have time to go into a critique of resilience, all I would say here is that while, yes, it's important, it is being manipulated. And to me, the idea of being resilient as getting back to normal or resisting change is not so exciting. You know, planning and urban development used to be about a progressive, better future. But if the best we can hope for is resilience, I think that says a lot about the relationship between globalization and urban spaces. So, 20 seconds to spare. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the speech and for being on time. Richard Grant is a professor at the University of Miami, USA. He is the Director of International Studies as well as Urban Studies, Director at the University of Miami. He is a Senior Research Associate, School of Tourism and Hospitality, University of Johannesburg, South Africa. Welcome.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I wanted to really thank the organizers. This has been a wonderful event. I mean, I've come from Miami, and you know, I just want to come back to Istanbul again, and come back to this event again in the future. And I know what goes into organizing a conference, and you did a terrific job. I wanted to today really switch it a little bit and talk about the African region. And to follow up on some of the groundwork that was laid out very well by Professor Knox, I wanted to really start with the present in Africa and take you to the future. So what kinds of urban futures are we going to have in African cities? And then I'll end up showing you a new project that's developed in Cape Town, and it's the first green industrial estate on the African continent, and they're trying to transition to a more climate resilient, climate tech type of economy. And so that's where I'll go and through this various talks. So I'm going to talk about economic space and industrialization. Now, mostly when you think about globalization, the sort of consensus view is that sort of Africa has been left out. There has been a failure to develop manufacturing in Africa. There's been different experiments, no matter whether they picked a socialist or a capitalist type of economy, manufacture doesn't seem to have worked out very well. And typically the literature sums it up that there's premature industrialization. And this is very intriguing because what we have in Africa are some of the fastest growing cities in terms of urbanization, a very compressed growth period. It's not taking thousands of years as it did in Europe and other parts of the world, but within a matter of a decade, African cities are dramatically expanding. And then I wanted to think about the future. So what will the new, in the fourth industrial revolution, robotics, AI, the Internet of Things, what kinds of future is this going to bring for Africa? So I'm going to suggest that perhaps there is an opportunity here for a more green industrial pathway. Africa missed the sort of dirty industrialization, brown industrialization we associate with China, Asia, maybe Turkey in another era, and that maybe a green is a more particular productive pathway. So outside of highly industrialized economies, there isn't really green spaces. I'm sure everybody in the room is familiar with this, but there has been a historic relationship that's well established between industrialization and growth rate. So if you want to grow your economy, you industrialize. And you can see that most regions have followed this. Africa happens to be an outlier. So then, if we think about this state of premature industrialization in Africa, what are the options? So for a while, African countries followed all the advice from the West and from the World Bank and various think tanks, but this sort of business as usual didn't really work out well. The last decade, what was in vogue is to shift the sort of paradigm and try to bring about industrialization and urbanization in Africa following the Chinese or a Dubai model. And for the most part, this hasn't been very successful. There are lots of Chinese SEZs in Africa, but none of them, apart from a couple in Ethiopia, really don't make a dent in terms of the economic landscape. And just a quote from Einstein, which might sum up that you can't keep doing things the same way and hoping for different outcomes. We need to think dramatically different about the future. Here you see the economic growth, the rapid urbanization. I mean, think of Africa, sub-Saharan, having about a billion population, but within a couple of decades, it'll be 2 billion. And then the questions are, is it a sort of region that's following the case of China or India 20 or 30 years ago, or should it be a different type of model? These are the ideas that were around maybe about a decade ago, that African cities would dramatically transform, bring in Swiss urban planners, US urban planners, have urban designers, sort of neoliberal fantasies. You know, they look good on paper, there are lots of websites, these are highly critiqued in the literature. I think they were sort of ideas that were transposed from the outside in. Now, why it's important to diversification, and I'm sure you're very aware of this in terms of Turkey, there are success stories out there of countries that start off at a very low base level, that diversify into different types of manufacturing activities and can really grow their economies and help improve their urban spaces. I mean, Taiwan is a good example, very small country in a very vulnerable position, has a very tense relationship with mainland China, but it's the 21st largest economy in the world by GDP, and it has one of the biggest high-tech companies that's a huge employer in mainland China, which is Foxconn. So there are examples around there of countries that start off on a low trajectory that are able to transform their cities and urban space by diversifying their economy. Now, I think we need to be very critical of the kind of Ethiopia model. It's often hailed by World Bank and other organizations as a big success model. Ethiopia got into producing a lot of cheap women's shoes or fast fashion brands. They're usually Chinese factories that relocate to Ethiopia, which is landlocked, by the way, and they've built a high-speed rail from Ethiopia to Djibouti. And then from Djibouti, they serve a lot of markets in Europe, I'm sure Turkey, United States, and other places. But when you read into the Ethiopia success story, it's really stuck in a very low-wage economy. In fact, there's a very interesting podcast that the BBC did that families can't live on the kinds of wages that are paid in the garment industry. So this may not seem to be a viable model, although developing countries will have to entertain some production in textiles and apparel. Now, some things I wanted to get us to think about is that there is a movement on also about globalization and a retreat. And perhaps the best examples we could think of, the United States government, the Trump administration, Make America First again, the different trade wars that are going on, especially between the US and China. Or we could think about the saga in Britain, the Brexit, which seems to go on and on and on, where there is almost a nostalgic view of returning to the past and to the glory days and imagining a very different type of global economy. And then we can think also about the sort of youth, how transformative, high school, secondary school, and even students are now, who are beginning to think about climate change, climate crisis, what kinds of future will be left to their generation in a decade or so. So I want us to think about this. So how would countries adapt? How would they maneuver within this changing landscape where a lot of countries seem to be withdrawn? Climate issues are more on the top of agenda, and it really doesn't make sense in the long term to make things in factories in China or Vietnam or Turkey and send them to Miami and New York and London. We have to start thinking about the environmental footprint, the carbon footprint, the costs in this earlier round of globalization. Now, one thing that African policymakers are worried about, and African youths in particular, is that AI is coming, the robots are coming. This is a frightening specter, just like climate change. And then there is the issue often raised, well, if Africa missed out in the first round of manufacturing development, how are they going to be prepared for the AI and the high-tech Internet of Things that's going to emerge? Now, we can think about how changes are going to come, advanced robotics, 3D printing, the reshoring of particular products. We can think of Adidas moving a lot of production back to Germany, Burberry moving production back to the UK. There seems to be a trend going on in some sectors of manufacturing industries moving closer to their market rather being operating at arm's length and over extensive production networks like we had in the past. Now, it is frightening if you read about these scenarios. So how many jobs are going to be lost? Well, the estimates, go anywhere from 10% globally to 80%. And it may be that some jobs are never even created in the first place. So it's a very different landscape that we're looking at. Just a quick slide here where you get a sense on the position of leading players in terms of AI. China in particular is developing AI in terms of manufacturing, the United States, Western Europe. There are some sectors too, it's not homogeneous across sectors, but things like automobiles, there has a lot of application of AI and robotics. Things like apparel and clothing has very, very little. It seems that labor force, and having adapted labor force seems much more important. So it's not even across sectors. So this is something that we also need to think about in terms of the future, that these big processes that are being developed are not going to be similar across all manufacturing and economic space. Sorry, I'll just go back. Oops. Oh, that's just fine. Oh, over there, okay, sorry. A couple of things then to highlight about Africa that are going on. They signed an African trade agreement. So it involves the majority of countries in sub-Saharan Africa. And, you know, trade agreements haven't worked in the past, regional trade agreements. But policymakers are now thinking differently, that they would make lower quality, cheaper products that they could sell to neighboring countries. So they're not necessarily thinking of regional trade agreements to sell to a global market. So this is one very interesting and different trend. So there are opportunities now for more intra-regional trade among African countries. And then if you think about globally, you know, I think there is a slowing of global trade, and I think that this will be more pronounced as we start to incorporate more climate-sensitive thinking into our trade and economic policies. Let's see. Okay, so this is the sort of changing landscape. Now, countries which we've heard already and cities are very concerned with the Sustainable Development Goals. And they're beginning to think about new products and new technologies that could help manufacturing in terms of facilitating and meeting some of these particular goals. Climate change, just to sort of emphasize, I think long-haul trade is going to be very, very difficult going forward. And the kinds of technologies now that some of the leading edge companies are trying to develop are things like water-saving devices, electric cars, solar cars, renewable energy, much more what we call green tech types of products. So this is part of this sort of changing landscape. And then, you know, elections, as you all know, are sort of very unknown. So we don't know who will be elected in the next round of the US elections. But it's interesting that some of the Democratic candidates, at least, seem to be talking more about a green agenda. So Joe Biden is talking about some kind of tariff that would be imposed by the US on polluting countries around the world. Or Warren is beginning to talk about a sort of a new Marshall Plan, new developing aid to help countries around the world become more green. So I think there's winds of change here in a variety of dimensions. Now, turning to South Africa as an example, they have really gone on a green tilt, but especially in Western Cape Province and around the city of Cape Town. It used to be that South Africa was known as a mineral producer. It used a lot of fossil fuels. It had a lot of links to Europe based on its old colonial past. It then tried to experiment with trying to get Chinese factories to locate in South Africa. And it hasn't brought about a lot of economic success. So it's in an economic recession right now, similar maybe to what people have been experiencing in this part of the world in recent years. Now, the population are beginning to think different in South Africa because it's a climate hotspot. And Cape Town was one of a few cities around the world in recent years that had a day zero, a day where they thought that the city would run out of water. And this is amazingly transformational. They asked people to limit to 2-minute showers. They invested a lot in green technology. The green agenda got put much more in terms of the local policy community. And in 2018, they opened the first green tech special economic zone. They're going to link, it's outside the city of Cape Town. It's in an area that was deindustrialized. It was doing very well in the 70s, but seemed to fall into rapid economic decay. They're going to link to various ports and airports, and they're going to try to emphasize renewables, and they've been linking a lot to European firms, and develop water saving and other kinds of technologies. So Atlantis, they started working on it in 2011, so it took 7 years to be set up as a zone and to operate a variety of incentives. They have lots of incubators on the site, and they have been quite successful because incubator small firms have notorious failure rates. Then being able to bring some products to markets, water-saving devices, etc. And one of the things that I think is very interesting is they involve the community in terms of their governance. So they actually had an election. There are 15 different groups from the community, and they now liaise with the estate in trying to make it not an enclave development, but something that involves the community in terms of skilling and in terms of developing. Now, it's still early days for Atlantis. I've done one round of field work. I'm going to do more. They have a lot of investment in the pipeline. They have a lot of solar power areas very nearby. They're trying to sort of clean up the types of environment. And it's been used in South Africa as a lesson to other industrial estates that they should begin to green and follow a more sustainable model. I read in the last week that countries like Nigeria, Kenya, Rwanda are also thinking about moving into green tech and green types of industry. So this is all very new, but there is a broad-based support that's grassroots, that's almost starting from the ground upward. So it's not necessarily an idea that's imposed from the outside or that consultants and other specialists have been encouraging. There seems to be what's grown out of crisis, and particularly in South Africa, a water crisis, a fear that if we don't do something differently, our water is going to dry up, or our global economic problems are going to be a lot more. So the last slide, just to sort of leave you with some final thoughts and thinking about the major goals. You know, technology is always risky. It's always an abruptive change. It's always disruptive, but I think that municipalities and cities need to not only think about the present, but to begin to be more forward-looking. And I think, you know, a green economy is not just sort of manufacturing, but it can link with local agriculture, it can link to renewable energy, and it can have many multiplier links in terms of the local economy. So I think we're going to see a lot of these green industrial estates in terms of the future. So I'll leave it at that, and thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Bir sonraki konuşmacımız Fuat Keyman. Kendisi öncelikle...
Our next speaker is Fuat Keyman. He is a friend of mine from Middle East Technical University, and also he's the director of social impact at Sabancı University. And he is a deputy dean at Sabancı University and a lecturer in international relations. Professor Keyman is an expert on globalization, democratization, international relations, Turkey-EU relations, Turkish foreign policy, and civil society development. So the floor is yours.
Old days in Middle East Technical University is very nice. And let me begin by thanking the organizers for inviting me to this conference. And also let me say that I am honored to be with these scholars, experts on urbanization and landscape. And I am maybe the only one who is not urban planner or architect. I'm a political scientist, international relations. And 20 years ago, I been invited by Peter Berger of Boston University and late Samuel Huntington of Harvard University to be part of their 13 countries research on what they called multiple globalization, and Turkey was one of them. And I directed the Turkey research with Ergun Özbudun, and we focus on urbanization in Anatolian cities, which changed my academic career. It started with this research and hobby, but last 20 years I've been working on Anatolian cities and urbanization in Turkey in terms of how periphery has become urbanized in Turkey and what that meant for Turkey's economy, democracy, international relations. So I will stop here in terms of speaking English and turn to Turkish because I am from Turkey and there are a bunch of visitors from Turkey. And if there is questions in the Q&A in English, I will actually answer them in English, but I will do my presentation in Turkish.
As we all know, in the last 20 years, we are living in a global world. About globalization, there are different studies and research, and there's a common understanding in certain areas. One is, in a globalized world, everyone is interconnected, even hyper-connected. So we live in such a world. First of all, let's look at globalization with potentials. Since 2000s, in the last 20 years, well, after the financial crisis of 2001 and after 2011, there has been too many crises. And now we have more risks than potentials. And in this globalized world, we have multi-crises in security, in economy, in climate. We're suffering from crisis. And of course, poverty, unemployment, violence, and in cultural areas, well, being marginalized, we are suffering from crisis. So, on one hand, we have a hyper-connected world thanks to the globalization, but in this world, there are different crises, multi-layered crises, and we have to say that. And second of all, I have participated in different projects, and there we have seen as well, in a more globalized world, you see a more urbanized world, and globalization should be studied as urbanization. So now we have this concept. So between globalization and urbanization, in terms of timing and space, there is a relationship. Thirdly, all the risks of globalization in security, economy, and ontology, well, we see all those crises in urban areas. So, at the level of states, we are discussing this, but in terms of experience, we have globalization and urbanization, and this means that in terms of space, those crises take place in cities. From economy to ontology, those crises have a huge impact on livability of those cities, because on one hand there is this huge gentrification, and with neoliberalism there is a clash between neoliberal urbanization and human beings, because when neoliberalism is in crisis, then there are negative impacts on cities. And then about habitability, livability of cities, the coexistence. In terms of coexistence, from human rights to marginalization, there are different problems in cities, and cities experience all those problems. So, given such a case, urban spaces become an area of negotiation between the capital and the space. Then the economic transformation and coexistence policies of cities, on one hand we have urbanization, and on the other hand we have a process which is really tough to manage. So at the level of countries, we need to put cities in a global context, because urbanization and globalization go way beyond national states. So, in concrete terms, there are two criteria. One is the scale, because globalization brings urbanization, but not all cities are equal. There are three types of cities. One is global cities, or city basins like Istanbul, New York, Los Angeles, Beijing. Those huge economic zones, those mega cities. And some of those cities are way more developed than the economies of some countries. For example, the top economies, when you look at them, 18 of them are cities. Second type of cities is some cities with a smaller scale, but those who contribute hugely in the economy of the country. So we call them city regions. And city regions have a huge impact on the city itself and on the country in terms of livability, in terms of coexistence. Those city regions are important. In addition to them, there are some self-sufficient cities, like some cities of human rights, cities of markets. They define themselves as such. In the recent period, Copenhagen and Houston are compared to one another in the literature. And the previous two speakers put it forward as well. Together with urbanization, the administration of cities becomes even more important, and there are new concepts in this sense. Like what? Like smart cities coming from neoliberalism. And secondly, the World Bank conducts different studies, and they go for the term inclusive cities. And thirdly, the Barcelona municipality started an initiative to make cities more democratical, more inclusive, and they call it wise cities. Wise cities. And in the last period, both in Turkey and in Europe, indeed all around the globe, we see refugees. So regarding the refugee crisis, we see city networks. Again, Barcelona started an initiative and Berlin is included, solidarity cities. There are such concepts. And Izmir also thinks about this, Vienna also, cities of human rights. There are such municipalities as well. In addition to those concepts, cities are very important and there are some projects. One is at our center, we are working on this as well. The new local cities rank higher than countries in this understanding. So there is an epistemological and methodological shift. That is the new local. The populism, especially the authoritarian regimes or leader-based leadership, in such periods, how can we protect local administrations? How can we put them at the front? In Europe, I have also participated in some movements like new municipalities. So that is the main part of my speech, but let me say that globalization becomes more urbanized, and together with urbanization there are the risks of globalization, and mostly we see those risks in cities, and city administration gets more complex. Rothberg says the second modernity. In the cities come forward, but we need a new paradigm in terms of city administration. So in Turkey, there are such studies as well. In this conceptual framework, when we look at Turkey like Africa, in Turkey as well, like some countries, in Turkey there is a rapid urbanization. And when we study the urbanization and globalization, Turkey is a great lab. After 50s, we see the start of urbanization, and then it gets more swift. And Turkey is like 70% of the Turkish population lives in cities. So there is a transition from agriculture to industry, and now Turkey is an urban space. And this urbanization, when we compare this with India, Brazil, Russia, China, and Latin American countries, and South Africa, Sheriff Martin uses this center periphery concept. In this model, you start with the periphery. In the last 20 years, the urbanization took place in the form of urbanization of the periphery. So you see an urbanized Anatolia today. So when we compare again, in spite of economic crisis and neoliberalism, Turkey gets urbanized and the middle class is increasing with a per capita of $10,000 in Turkey. In terms of sociology, we see urbanized middle class in Turkey, and the urbanization takes place first in peripheries. So in this understanding, when we evaluate Turkey, in theory, we can employ some concepts for Turkey, like what? Like not cities of Turkey, but Turkey of cities. Then we see a global city like Istanbul. Istanbul starts with Tekirdağ until Bursa. You have Istanbul, and Istanbul contributes in the national economy like 40%. So it is the center of Turkey, together with its history and globalization. Istanbul links Turkey to the globe. So we see Istanbul as an urban zone. So without understanding Istanbul, it's not possible to understand Turkey. And there's something maybe even more, not an urban zone maybe, but we see some city regions in Anatolia, like Çağlarkedar and Ayşe Köysel and Fuat study Turkey based on these city regions. We focus on İzmir, Konya, Van, and Adana, Mersin. So rather than cities of Turkey, the Turkey of cities, city regions are very important because those cities contribute hugely in their regions. They contribute in regional development. That's why they contribute hugely in Turkey. So the highest potential in Hamburg, Rotterdam, in Turkey it is İzmir. So it is not easy to distinguish İzmir from Bergamo, from its region. It is a city region. Again, Diyarbakır, Batman, Mardin, the same. Gaziantep, Urfa, Adıyaman, those are also city regions. So as a lab, we can study Turkey as city regions. Last but not least, Turkey is a great lab, I said, because cities are important and there are new paradigm search for city administration. Thanks to the transformation of the last 5 years, Turkey got more centralized, and Turkey is not understanding the dynamics of cities, and Turkey is trying to administer all those cities from the center. Sociologically, those cities are crucial, but still in terms of administration there is a misunderstanding. So we need a governance model based on cities, but in the last 5 years the center is trying to manage all those cities, and on one hand we have the dynamics of globalization and urbanization. Then Turkey is suffering from the urbanization of neoliberalism, and together with the central approach, cities cannot develop. So in elections, when we look at voting patterns, cities which are close to the ruling party are suffering from this problem again. Istanbul, İzmir, Ankara, and Konya, Kayseri, they don't have much difference or opponent parties in Istanbul, İzmir, Ankara. When you compare those cities with Van, Diyarbakır, cities close to the ruling party, you don't see much difference. But what I would like to suggest is, in Turkey and in the whole world, there is a future based on cities, socially and demographically. So the administration of cities is crucial for Turkey, for the globe. In global governance, we see the importance of cities. So if you cannot govern a city, if you cannot transform a city, if you cannot make a city inclusive, wise, democratic, then you won't be able to be successful, and you will be more introverted. You can call it the industrial revolution for all. You need to get prepared. That's why cities will make the difference. So the governance of cities is questioned. in this period, and governance paradigms are shifting, not only in urban planning and architecture, but in politics, in international relations, and in sociology. That's why it's a pleasure for me to be here. I both learn and I also had a chance to share my perspective. Thank you.
Biz de çok teşekkür ediyoruz.
Thank you very much. Nihal Perera.
At Ball State University, the two-time Fulbright scholar, was also senior research fellow at the National University of Singapore, and a primary contributor to the field of post-colonial urban studies. Professor Perera's main research areas are community and national development, social justice, quantitative methods, and the social production of space. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. A big thanks to the organizers of this conference. It's a fantastic conference I enjoyed. And a big thanks to my friend, colleague, Dr. Celal, Honor, for inviting me here. And a big thanks also to the speakers who laid out the contours of globalization, and then, of course, Professor Fuat, who complexified the whole thing, you know, like bringing in specificities, and fantastic. Let me see whether I can actually complexify it further. Much of these slides will, I mean, I'm not going to read any of these, it's for your aid. I'll try to make the story a little simple and see. I think the point of departure for me is they say Asia is going to lead the world. You know, I think it's a very common knowledge right now, and there are debates about how and when and how, you know, and so on. But the thing is, if that is the case, what do we see in South and Southeast Asia, Southeast and Southeast Asian urbanization, which is kind of like happening very fast? What do we see there? What can we understand? So one of the things is, I mean, I'm trying very hard to kind of like pull this out of the mainstream discourse, if possible. So if you go to Shanghai, I know a lot of people would talk, I mean, even the previous speakers kind of like showed all the architect design buildings and so on. If you go to Shanghai, you will also see this, right? And out of 32 million people or whatever lives there, 30 million people have nothing to do with those CBDs, nothing to do with those CBDs, because they're trying to make a living, you know, under those particular circumstances. So the local actors actually create space. Actually, it's the governments and capital produce abstract spaces like roads and so on, you know, like and public spaces and so on. They become public spaces and roads and so on when people use them. Right? I mean, this is the, so it is people who create space. I mean, not necessarily the capital and the governments. Here's a good example of that understanding from outside understanding. On the top one is a bridge in Kathmandu. And then the bottom one is somebody who built a fantastic bridge, you know, using modern engineering and et cetera, built it. But nobody uses that. People still use the bridge on the upper one, because the other bridge doesn't go from anywhere to anywhere. And much of the infrastructure projects that we see today, we can make photos, but they hardly serve the population of these cities. On the right-hand side is also, it's given with real good kindness. This was after the tsunami, an NGO gave boats. And I asked those guys who were just drinking, why are you not going back to the sea? You know, like, why are you, I mean, you have boats and so on. He said, we don't know these boats. We have never used, because people coming from outside, they think they are doing a great job by giving them boats. But the thing is, there are many seas, there are many kinds of fish, there are many kinds of fishing, and so on. You know, if you are not with the people, then you can give a lot of things that is not very useful for people. So here's an example of, sorry. I had my second Fulbright in Yangon, and I could, just before I left, the Dutch government gave a huge fund to the Yangon city government to build a waterfront, to upgrade the waterfront, because there was the harbor and so on. The consultants came and showed fantastic, slides, like a man and a woman sitting across the table, like eating cake and sort of like drinking coffee, overlooking the water and so on. And then eventually I asked the consultant, do you know how Myanmar people use waterfronts? He said, and would you like to talk to people right here? Yes, we need to talk to people. But I mean, of course, people are the people who are sitting around that table, and I'm one of them. And to give you a little glimpse, I lived right next to the biggest, water body in the city. This is how people use. I mean, couples come, people jog and all these things. None of this in the development proposal, which was pretty much like the examples of which were London Docklands, Baltimore waterfront, et cetera, which has nothing to do with this place. So in a way, it is the appropriation of space rather than providing any space for these people. I also happen to be the chief architect planner of the largest development project in Sri Lanka. I was in charge of planning 12 new towns in the 1980s. One of the things that we immediately realized was, I was very young, naive. I couldn't even talk like this at that time. So these plans didn't work because they were, the government funding methods and so on did not support these master plans. Because after, say, 10, 15 years, there were 10, 15 buildings in a jungle because they were following the plan. So we decided that we're going to, let me see whether I have it. Yeah, we decided that we're going to have an incrementally growing town plan where planning becomes a verb. We refuse to be plan makers. We were planners engaged with people and the town. Sorry about this. So let's go get to the globalization discourse. So Asia is transforming heavily. These are all like more CBD type of transformations. So I was looking at this discourse on Asian cities, and I was asking the question, what do they look at, these studies? 60% of the studies looked at 60% of the studies looked at the CBD, right? Pudong was kind of like big those days, and many of those cities. So for me, I was just wondering, I also see that, because I'm also Western educated, I of course teach in the United States, and so on. So of course, CBD is very easy to spot, we can see that, right? Then, of course, 30% of the literature is about slum. It's about the downside, the poverty. For me, it sounds like the opposite of the developed Western city, right? Then another 10% of the literature is about heritage. The great heritage that Asia has, which for me relates very much to the Hegelian idea that Asia is stuck in the past. Right? We are so much interested in the past, we live in the past, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, but the issue for me is kind of like when you look at all these, actually the reference is to the Western city, all the references. How could we even begin to understand the Asian city if we don't have any way to understand that, right? So for me, there is an enormous empirical presence of the Asian city. There's a lot of details, data and everything, but how we understand comes from the West. So I think we need to look besides, below, beneath, above, and in the cracks of this discourse. And so what did we look? What did the scholars look at, and the planners? Now, how did they look at it? In order to look at, we position things in a larger scheme of things, right? We look at globally, we compare, and historical streams, right? So where do these larger instances come from? There's hardly any larger instances that we borrow from China or India or Vietnam to kind of understand something. They all come from the West, right? So whatever we see in Asia becomes data, and then the interpretations come from the West. So it is a Western discourse. There's no way it can be a local discourse, right? I mean, I think Professor Fuat tried to kind of talk about the local, and you could see how complex it gets, how unmanageable it gets, and so on. So, I mean, Will Glover very nicely said that when the colonials, the British, were ruling, they always looked at objects and tried to understand the people, not asking people for their interpretations. But, Tim Mitchell has written how the French and so on and the British kind of saw the pyramids. If you go to Egypt, pyramids are nothing for them. For local people, I mean, they don't even care about pyramids. But we like to, fix people through whatever we see and however we interpret them, right? And then they become familiarized with that, and they start, through museums, and exhibitions, they become familiar and they talk about their own place in this Western discourse. And then from where do we look at? We can look from outside, we can look from inside, or we can use the inside, outside, the middle point to kind of look out, the threshold to look outwards. So we are looking at global to understand, right? So I think the most important thing is we need to learn about people, because at the end it is the people who create space. People in the sense, maybe judges, maybe all sorts of different people, and very ordinary people as well. And then build on people's spatial stories to understand this, Because even McDonald's, we can see McDonald's is a sign of globalization. Actually, if you go to Delhi, it's nonsense. Because McDonald's in Delhi has halal food and also Maharaja burgers. So, I mean, it's not the same McDonald's. It can never go. Ideas cannot cross cultural boundaries. Ideas cannot cross cultural boundaries. So if we privilege the economy and the polity, which have been reformulated into Western way of thinking, then of course we will see certain things. But if we can actually pay a little bit of attention to the culture of this, then we will start seeing something totally different. So I would rely on some Asian interpretations. I don't know where to find them. So, so this is the result. So what happens in Asia is we are not producing knowledge in Asia. We become custodians of the Western knowledge in Asia. And we say, hey, you're wrong, because I know the knowledge. I went to this university, whatever, right? So there's hardly any production. They have conferences, very third level. So this is, so the big discourses have not solved much. Actually, I see the UN, UNDP, whatever they kept talking here in the last 2 days as well. There's not much difference to whatever they talked like 40, 50 years ago, right? I mean, it's a growth, it's development, it's, now, of course, green urbanism and stuff like that come into play. So these discourses, oppositional discourses, have actually not necessarily questioned, but it has actually supported neoliberalism. Let me see, okay. Yeah, so I think it is time to Asianize Asian knowledge. I don't want to start talking about Turkey, I think, or any other place. I will let you figure that out, because I'm questioning the generalization. And actually, if you see Asian cities, you see very interesting things. The top one is Seoul, South Korea, a woman making kimchi on the street, right? I mean, this can never feature in this large discourse. So I also explored how people create spaces in addition to the transforming Asian cities, right? So just snippets of kind of like what I follow. People always struggle within their own immediate context and constraints, in immediate context of constraints and opportunities to produce a meaningful life with their own political values and goals, right? I mean, can we kind of like begin to kind of like ask how and what do they produce. Community actors have a lot of great stories to tell. We don't have the time because we go with our spreadsheet and we want certain information. If we get our information, we are not actually listening to anybody there. Sorry, so that then we feel great that we have the information. But if you really want to understand people, you need to spend a lot of time because maybe a lot of people do not think in this in so-called paradigmatic thinking. A lot of people think in narrative thinking. So can we engage, rather than getting them to engage our discourse and feeling good about our discourse, can we engage their discourse? Meaning instead of getting them to participate in our processes and planning and globalization or whatever, can we actually participate in their process? Because globalization doesn't happen in the sky. It happens at homes, at various places. I'll give you a quick example. Near Kathmandu, a boy comes to see a girl as a marriage proposal, and then the girl lives in a beautiful vernacular house. Architects love these things. And then the guy decides, I'm not going to marry this girl. And then after they leave, the wife says to the husband, if you keep doing this, if you're not building a modern house, our daughter will stay at home forever. Right? So it's very interesting. These discourses go, but the thing is they become materialized by people. Right? And I think it is time, and it's very important to decenter the mainstream discourses, and also to understand that we may not understand things fully. We have to maintain the rebellious presence of the subjects in our discourses. There's no clean discourse. So people are actually transforming. People are transforming Asian cities. People are transforming American cities. People are transforming all sorts of different cities and spaces. Can we follow them? I mean, following doesn't make us like less of us, right? So I think people like Gustavo Esteva has kind of argued, why are we looking for a revolution? Why do you want to export a revolution? Revolution is already going on. Can we actually understand this and take part in this? So I developed this, if you want, you can actually, it's in this book, basically. I developed this various ways of kind of like, which Lefebvre calls like the interaction between abstract space and lived space. How do people live in spaces that are provided, whether it's global or whether it's whatever, and how do they negotiate? And the most important thing that I found was the production of space comes from the state and capital, which is politics and economics and political economy, but the resistance comes in the form of culture. If you do not know that, then we will miss like how spaces operate, basically. So I think there are lots of spaces that I put on this slide. I don't have time, so I will go through this. And there are books that talk about the city in a broader sense, which is inclusive. We cannot talk about inclusive if we can look at it from the top and from outside. Yeah. And Joseph Allen talks about Taiwan, Taipei. Each place has a history, a story of contingencies and changes, layers of production and construction, often reaching back through the decades and centuries that informed its contemporary condition. I'm not talking about one dimension, but multiple dimensions. Okay, I'm going to skip these. Oops. I'm going to skip the good part. Oops. Hello. Okay. Sorry. Yeah. So I think we talked so much about the city governments and so on. So I'm trying to make my research not statist, state-centered or capital-centered. Because even if we critique, we use the same thing. We reinforce the center, empowering these forces and disempowering the others. So rather, can we decenter these powers? And yeah, the big global discourses have not solved very much, but but actually help neoliberalism. I mean, I think the way to go around is to decenter them, not to fight directly, because when you fight directly, you reinforce. So I think maybe the time to follow the revolution.
Okay, thank you very much, especially for being in time. Paul Knox established a basic frame and constructed a kind of a conceptual background towards understanding the relation between industry, modernism, and urbanism. And within the relation of these three concepts, I mean, he mentioned second modernity, where, I mean, we are witnessing a transformed form of modernity by the influence of globalization and its reflections, its representations in the urban scale. So that was a very, I think, good introductory and background discussion. And on that background, actually, Richard Grant had been concentrated on Africa as a region and the unique examples with similarities and dissimilarities. He outlined the significance and importance of climate on economy, of course, on one hand, and the relation between other geographies in Africa, how that influenced on urbanization. And he also outlined the relation between technology, environment, and economy, I think, as the basic determinants of an urbanization process, which represents its different impacts in region-wise scale. Fuat Keyman, coming from a different disciplinary field, I mean, had outlined within a different position, I mean, he looked in a different position as Nihal mentioned, I mean, and he mentioned about a kind of a hyper-connected statue and of the urban tissue, where it both represents, on one hand, the potentials, but on the other hand, turbulences, crisis, and risk at the same time. So it is a kind of a complex development and transformation to be understood in a multidimensional way. So, I mean, he referred to a concept of multiple crises, maybe, or plural crises at a time, influential on urban growth. So there are lots of headlines like economy, climate, security, and maybe income, injustice, etc., as the titles of this crisis, and which are at the same time are effective on the cities. And also, I think one concept was very unique for us. He mentioned not only the cities, but a regional development or impact on urbanization. So if you consider Istanbul, for example, we are witnessing 40% of Turkish economy within a regional production, which should not only limits the development and transformation of Istanbul itself, but at the same time totally transparent and transformative on the whole other Turkish cities. So he outlined a concept of new locality, actually, as an outlining discussion. And finally, I mean, in a similar way, Nihal Perera focused on Asia as a case study, mostly, how all these concepts that we all discussed had been represented themselves in the local scale. And Asia, as you know, I mean, with its high transformation capacity and the economic growth is subject to lots of case studies. And he tried to discuss the relation between globalization and urbanization with reference to local actors, which was very unique and interesting in my opinion. So, I mean, he outlined the contradiction between the outsiders, so-called, I mean, including maybe the institutional bodies, and the people who are the locals in the urban space, and he addressed the behavioral differences and the relation with the urban space and the how they construed the technological and economical development. Another very significant issue was, I mean, how we study this urbanization within scale and region-wise. I think that was very interesting for me. As he mentioned, yes, when you say, I mean, I recognize that it is like this, many studies are concentrating on CBDs, central business district areas, as if, I mean, they are the cities themselves. But as Fuat Bey reminded us, actually, I mean, they are the constructed or abstract models of universal, I mean, globalization. So it may be very interesting or necessary or inevitable to look at slums, historical centers, and other places of the city to get the full picture. In this case, I mean, as much as where we look at the things, I mean, where do we look at, from where we are looking at the things are significantly important. So I think, I mean, all the speeches in this panel was complementary to each other to obtain a kind of a complete picture. So I would like to thank all of our speakers once again. I think we have few minutes for the contributions and the questions, and I have a quite industrial technological tool for this. Hopefully there will be some questions here, but there are none at the moment. Is it a technological problem, or, I mean, everything is clear and perfect so that, I mean, you have nothing to ask? There is somebody over there. I have done all this refreshment as it was taught. Olur. Çok teşekkürler. Oh, there are questions. There are questions. Okay. Let me start with the row. Richard Grant. Obviously, because of the third generation, many jobs will be lost. I wonder what kind of jobs will be added into Africa job market. Do you think there is an opportunity for Africa to adapt itself to fourth generation?
It's a huge question and a very good question. I mean, there has to be, right? There has to be jobs. I think that the sort of way that African economies have
Yes.
Okay, thank you. I think there has to be, we have to be hopeful about jobs, but certainly having everybody working in the informal economy and people cycling into informal trade, which is the current situation, that's not going to happen. So this is why I think the sort of a green turn, green tilt, it has to be very serious. We cannot, you know, be trading kiwi fruit from New Zealand to Miami. You know, we can't be manufacturing things in China and have no clothing industry in Africa. So, you know, what I began to think about is really a fundamental change. You know, African cities, African economies, doing things for themselves, thinking more of inter-regional trade, which seemed to evaporate in the colonial, post-colonial period. So yes, I think it is a huge challenge, of course, but I remain sort of optimistic that if they can think about smart technologies, adapting to climate crises, focus more on local food production, these kinds of things can generate jobs. But relying on, you know, a foreign company to come in from wherever, Indonesia, Turkey, India, to employ local people, I think that's not a productive way.
Thank you very much. There are warnings that we are very short of time, but there are very interesting questions. I will ask them, but I'll maybe with one sentence only you will answer, okay? Professor Perera, there is around 1 billion people live in slums and similar conditions. Obviously, they are not making global headlines with positive stories and their stories. How do you think this discourse can change? Very easy question.
I think, yeah.
15 seconds, you can handle it.
I think that's the challenge, and I think sometimes, I think more than anything else, it is the discourse, as you're saying. Do they live in slums or do they live in homes? Have they kind of like built their own homes? Are they self-builders? Have they solved the problem, as John Turner would say, slums or self-built settlements are not a problem. It's a solution. Can we actually begin to see? So in a way, we need to change, not them, to begin with. And of course, it's about a discourse. Now, how to go about? I don't have a magic response, but I do take students every other year to Asia from the United States for a semester, and when we work, you know, at one stage, our students decided what they really need is a positive representation. Maybe we need to write about them and so on. And then in the newspapers, you know, of course, the newspapers like to kind of like, you know, brag about things, you know. So they said, oh, there are some Americans who are here. They are trying to give water, you know, like toilets and so on. I mean, which is a standard discourse. And our students were very worried. And then one of the faculty members at that university in Ahmedabad told me, Nihal, you should be very happy. Every time something goes bad in the city, they say, Charanagar people did that. Now, they are at least saying this. So maybe you are not giving anything, but be happy. So it's a very hard thing, you know, but I think we should keep at it.
Thank you very much. Professor Keyman, can we say that the concept of city region has a big synergy and some opportunities, but they affect badly neighbored cities in terms of basic development issues at the same time? Actually, it's something you already mentioned.
Yes, actually, in our project, we propose this, that the concept of city region is useful not only to analyze or study these cities, but also to understand and analyze Turkey. And then Turkey's future lies in the effective, fair and democratic governance of city regions. And secondly, this issue actually is not only related to economy, but also to do with the human condition. For instance, very briefly, there are 4 million Syrian refugees in Turkey. But when we look at actually where the Syrian refugees are, they are mainly in 12, 13 cities of Turkey, where we have 82 provinces and cities. So it is not Turkey and Turkish national government, but those cities have been trying to deal with, govern and live with these actually refugees and our friends. So in this sense, globalization is becoming urbanized. Turkey is becoming urbanized. Turkey is a very big part of globalization. So in this sense, governing the city in a fair, inclusive and democratic way will determine which direction Turkey will go and the capacity of Turkey to deal with its own problems.
Thank you very much. I'll take the last question to Professor Knox. And is resilience a more of conservative right-wing approach when compared it with sustainability, which is seen as a progressive approach? Why do we think resilience is getting more attention than sustainability? Very neighboring concepts, but
Yes.
this is also something I really wonder.
It's a great question. I realize I'm standing between the audience and coffee and the closing session.
Yeah.
I mean, I think the question has the answer embedded in it. I think that the situation that we're in, internationally, globally, and locally, is one that presses us to look more towards questions of resilience than sustainability. But I think both of them are becoming so popular, and certainly sustainability has been popular for a long time, that they become hollowed out, they're a little bit empty. They mean everything, many facets to each one, and so they become very slippery concepts.
Yeah, that's true, yeah. I always say that in the field of architecture, I mean, sustainability is not a new or an additional issue. It is the nature of architecture itself from Vitruvius onwards. So, I mean, that's why, I mean, we need, I think, further concepts to establish the differences. I would like to thank all of the participants and the audience for their patience. We have lots of other questions, but maybe we can talk personally later on. Thank you for joining us. Now we are going to closing panel. Okay, thank you very much.